Our healthcare system is focused on sick care, not healthcare.
You're saying let's go one layer deeper.
We assume if we feel fine that everything must be 100% under the hood. The vast majority of us basically punish our bodies in order to build a better future. The goal really is just to connect everyone with.
All right, guys, welcome back to Built America. We have Andrew Lacy here, who is the founder and CEO of Prenuvo. Andrew, how are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
Andrew, you migrated from Australia 20 years ago, and you started a magnificent company, I should say. Tell me a little about the journey of how you came from Australia to starting Prenuvo.
Well, I was heading down a completely different path. I studied law, so I sort of had a career in a long and probably very boring, but reasonably fruitful career in law ahead of me. I then went and did some consulting at McKinsey for a while, where I spent a bunch of time, I guess, advising other people what to do with their companies and then being disappointed that they didn't really follow the advice. And so I was always just a little bit frustrated, I suppose. I ended up moving in 2003 over to do an MBA in the US in the Silicon Valley. And that was the first time I was exposed to really internet digital companies. In Australia, where I grew up, it was just a website. And you sort of drive around Silicon Valley with some of these huge companies, that were sort of sitting behind these web pages that you would visit, doing really cool and interesting things. And so I sort of got the bug when I was in the Silicon Valley.
When I look at Prenuvo, you guys have a tagline here. It says, "Put your health in your hands." Usually, sometimes when people build a healthcare company, it can come from a personal or adverse effect. Why build a company around GANs and a healthcare company? And was anything relevant to you that's happened in your career that made you want to start this?
Yeah, so this is actually my fourth company. So I had a few others before then. And I would say my journey as an entrepreneur is not that different to many others. I mean, we're all building different things. Some are successful, some fail. But I would say universally, I consider being an entrepreneur to be hazardous to one's health. There should be a warning like you get on the cigarette packets that, I don't know any entrepreneurs that are working 9 to 5, that aren't stressed, that sleep really well, that have great diet and exercise. I mean, there's very few of them. The vast majority of us basically punish our bodies in order to build a better future, however that's defined. And so I was one of those guys where I just finished my third startup and I was getting excited about what I would do next. And I remember waking up, looking in the mirror and saying, well, I'm not 20 anymore. How do I know if I'm going to invest a ton of my time in something new? How do I know I'm going to be around to sort of reap the benefits of that? And that was sort of the start of my journey to learn more about my health.
You co-founded a couple companies before that. Let's walk through that. One was called Tapulous. It was an app store hit and you sold that to Disney. Tell me about the endeavor of starting that company.
I gotta be honest, it was super cool. And it was a cool moment to be in that space. We were, I learned about the potential for apps on mobile phones by connecting with a bunch of really sort of underground iPhone hackers. And they were 16-year-olds. I mean, I'd meet them on ICQ, which is sort of this thing that most of your listeners probably don't know what it was, sort of a pre-messaging platform. And the goal there was he was adult enough to actually employ, because it was all 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds hacking at iPhones. And what were they doing? They weren't trying to do anything horribly bad. They were just trying to build little apps so they could change the wallpaper on the background of their phone, or to build a little sort of Shazam-like thing so they could hold their phone up and figure out what the song was that they were listening to. And, we saw all this tremendous underground activity and no one else was looking at it. And it was such a cool feeling to just be the first, So we started that company before an app store was even announced by Steve Jobs. And we actually ran the underground app store for a while. We had our apps there. I bought 40 apps. There were some of the biggest hits in the early days. And when the app store launched, we already had millions of customers. So it was cool to be ahead of the curve and even to be ahead of investors as they looked at this space. The number of times I heard, oh, you should be building apps for Nokia and BlackBerry. That's why we're not investing in you, back in 2008. I mean, that was every VC investor in the Valley. So, so So it was kind of cool to be at the beginning of something that ended up being a really big wave.
Tell me about buying apps. Back in the day when you're doing the black market and you're before the app building apps was a big hit, you were buying them. How did you go about doing so?
I mean, they didn't have any value back then. There was no real way to monetize, and no one was monetizing them. It was pretty easy, if I'm being totally honest. I mean, we were buying apps for $1,000. I think the most expensive we bought was $10,000. And then we launched some of our own apps. I mean, we built, it's so silly to think now, sort of 15 years later, but back then we were looking and saying, okay, well, what would be, Yelp for mobile? Because Yelp wasn't looking at it. Like, what would be a restaurant review app? What would be like Facebook? What would be a social network that we'd be building around mobile? Because Facebook wasn't looking at it. So we had a bunch of our own bets, most of which went nowhere, because the rest of the world sort of caught on, maybe 12 months later. But it was easy. I mean, people were just excited. These hackers were just excited that someone was taking them seriously, and that potentially they could come work with us.
And then you evolved there after you sold this company from Disney. You probably took some time off. And then what I recall is that you went to Vancouver in 2018 and you had a DEXA scan of your entire body, and you had your first personalized experience of what a DEXA scan MRI really looks like of yourself.
Let's talk about the technology, because those two are quite different modalities. So I had this sort of coming to Jesus moment where I wanted to learn more about my own health. I was starting to feel older. I had something like a midlife crisis. And some people buy Ferraris. And in my case, I just wanted to learn more about my health. So I heard about someone who was doing these whole body scans up in Canada. So I got on a plane and went and did one myself. And it was really cool. I mean, I lay in this machine for an hour. I got out. I went straight into this other room and sat down with a radiologist who went through every single organ in my body. So, we look at our skin in the mirror, the outsides, every single day. I had no idea. That day I met the inner me. And learned a lot about my health that the health system didn't tell me. Learned, thankfully, I wasn't dying of anything. But, that I was, the way I was living my life was definitely causing some wear and tear. And I had such a profound experience around the peace of mind that I felt that instead of flying back to Silicon Valley, I basically stayed there for 6 months and saw another 150 odd people get the same experience. And they were told, some people were told that they had cancer. Some people were sent to the hospital straight away with a large aneurysm. Many people like me were told wear and tear. Some people got a clean bill of health, and it didn't matter whether it was like a life-threatening illness or all clear. The overwhelming sensation people had was just gratitude that they knew for the first time in their lives what was going on with their bodies. And that's what I knew, that this was, this could be huge. And, we had to find a way to bring this to everyone.
Where do you feel a lot of people get, wrong in healthcare in this regard? A lot of people go get blood work, and then they look at their blood work, and then they get prescribed certain prescriptions, whether it's vitamins, peptides these days. And then they look at that and say, oh, this is my solution. But then you're saying, let's go one layer deeper. Let's go understand what neurodegenerative diseases could be caused by, things you're putting in your body, and get a DEXA scan or an MRI for that, right? And you guys founded this company. Where do people get this wrong?
I mean, there's so many ways in which we get it wrong in society. First of all, our healthcare system is focused on sick care, not healthcare. So we don't even bother to look inside unless you're actually pretty sick. That's the starting point. We all know, ask any doctor, can cancer grow asymptomatically for many years? And the answer would be yes, but we don't really do anything about that. And that's why only 14% of cancers are caught on a, standard of care screening test. 1-4, so it's that's the first mistake that we make. I think as customers, as people, as individuals, the mistake we make also is, we assume if we feel fine that everything must be 100% under the hood. Now, we don't make that assumption about our cars. We take them in for preventive checkups. We don't make that assumption about planes that we fly in, every day. We wouldn't get in a plane if it didn't have like preventative maintenance and diagnostics. But this sack of flesh that we sort of drive around every day, we're quite comfortable just assuming everything is fine. And then even if we know that that's not the case, the last mistake we make as individuals is that we have been trained to be fearful of our health. I was so scared when I went to get my first scan, and I'm sure a lot of people come in and get Prenuvo scans, they're scared. The reason for that fear is because all of the stories we hear are horrible stories about things being caught late. Our health system has basically trained us to not want to know things about our health. And so we have to sort of unlearn that if we want to really take control and be in charge.
What do you think Prenuvo has found in the early stages when you guys launched this company that, traditional healthcare did not find? Walk us through some examples.
Sure. In the life-threatening category, it's cancers of all types of solid tumors, from pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, lung cancer, and non-smokers, brain tumors. I mean, you want to catch most of these early, and we're finding the vast majority of these when they're still localized. We've had more pancreatic cancers that have been successfully surgically operated on than pancreatic cancers that we find at a stage when you really can't do anything about them. The second category is aneurysms. We look for cerebral, aortic, and abdominal aneurysms. These are little outpouchings in our blood vessels that can grow. They're like little balloons. And the bigger they become, the more likely they are to pop. And when they pop, they tend to be fatal. So you want to catch those early. The second kind of big category of findings that we have are essentially early stage of chronic disease. So that might be, as you mentioned, neurodegenerative disease. We can see, I think, the signs of this, often decades before you might be clinically diagnosed. Metabolic disease, fatty liver, of which a lot of people in America have and don't know about. Kidney issues, digestive issues. A lot of people have spinal degeneration and they're asymptomatic. Knowing about all these things early means that you can make lifestyle modification and really, you can change the trajectory of that disease so it never ever arrives at a stage where it is quote unquote chronic. So those are sort of the main categories, I guess. And then the thing that I always struggle to communicate is like, we don't diagnose this, but like we provide peace of mind. And, I've never fully appreciated until I did the scan how much of my brain was consciously or subconsciously processing the state of my health. And not having to do that was like a huge lift. It's sort of like, I'm married. So it's sort of like, I remember when I was single, how much of my brain I was using thinking about, okay, dates and, meeting people and all that sort of stuff. And when you get married, wow, like a lot of extra time. I'm not thinking about that part. It's the same with your health. I mean, I would have spent just the same amount of time thinking about my health that I'm not thinking about now. And, as entrepreneurs, time is so valuable. It's like, another 5-10 hours of my week that I can devote to something that's more productive.
I think you make some very good points here. I actually spent the last 10 years, prior to building what I'm building now, in neurosurgery healthcare, and, saw tons of aneurysms, tons of brain tumors. And to this day, we don't understand why brain tumors exist, right? They can just happen out of nowhere. And I think what you've built here today is allowing a, pre-diagnostic disease of assuring that does not happen, and giving markers there for humans all across America, potentially all over the globe now as well, as you guys continue to go scale. When you guys opened your first clinic, walk us through that journey of how you guys opened that first brick and mortar clinic that you guys had. How did that come about?
Well, I mean, I would say overwhelmingly, we really struggled to raise money in the early days. And it reminded me of those early days of mobile, where all these smart investors were still focused on Nokia. They weren't thinking about Apple. And we have so many, smart investors in the healthcare space that are really focused on insurance reimbursability and, all of this sort of like this sort of evidence gathering that would take 30 or 40 years. And they're ignoring that consumers are really fed up and they want to take control themselves. So, we ended up bootstrapping in the early days. We had to raise some money from a bank, put in our own money. We managed to we were operating in Canada. So we opened our first clinic in Silicon Valley. We committed all of this capital of our own, pretty much my life savings. And then like COVID happened. So we're in the middle of construction when COVID kicked off. I'm like, oh, this is going to be a problem. But we sort of saw it through to the end. We opened in October of 2020 there. And the business grew ever since. So it was getting a location in Silicon Valley and then exposing a lot of investors, as patients to what we're doing, that finally enabled us to like raise money. But still, I mean, 90+% of investors, turn us down, even though they may be using us for their own health. It's just really hard to, it's very hard for investors. Let me say this another way. I think as an angel investor myself, it's really easy for me to tell a good from a bad business. It's really hard to tell like an incredible transformative business from like the worst idea ever. So it's really hard to tell the tails apart of the sort of distribution of ideas. And I think like great VCs, that should be their job to figure out like, is this in a tail? And, as long as I invest in a few of these transformative businesses, I can put out with a bunch of duds. But a lot of investors that don't behave that way. They're more, they're focused more on the good versus bad part of that normal distribution. And I think it's frustrating as an entrepreneur, and I don't think it leads to the best returns for sort of the LPs of some of those funds.
Yeah, I think the raising money aspect probably definitely has a health detriment to your ability to continue to live a good life, right? And you're obviously showing that. You talked about you risked it all. I saw some quotes and videos from Brian Chesky when he was raising money for Airbnb. I think he was raising at like a $2 million valuation. Couldn't get anyone in Silicon Valley to invest in his company. And then, of course, now I think Airbnb is bigger than the GDP of Croatia, and he's proved people wrong, obviously, right? And you've probably done the same. And what I would ask you today is, what was the biggest roadblock from raising money back in the day? You had put all your life savings in there. You're a third-time founder. Why do this, right? Why go and risk it all and go to Silicon Valley, try to go to do a moonshot here at Prenuvo and scale this to the venture that you've done today? Because there's such inherent risk. And even though you've done this 3 times, you got denied by 95% of your LPs. Walk us through the journey of like what everyone was saying no to, so the audience can understand.
Well, I think it was exactly the point I was just making. In some ways, the traditional medical system is really slow to adopt new technology. I mean, we have been talking about cancer moonshots for years. Nothing's happened. The sort of level of evidence gathering that's required to like even put in place a standard of care screening approach like mammogram is like 40 years. And doctors continue to like debate the merits of that, even though it saved millions of lives. So there's always a doctor out there that's going to say, any breakthrough medical approach is going to be problematic or is a bad investment. And a lot of VCs don't necessarily understand the space so well, so they depend a lot on the advice of doctors. So they're sort of like importing this very like conservative sort of mindset into a function, which is venture capital investing, which should in fact be the opposite. It should be sort of like loving risk and looking again for those real breakthrough ideas. So that's, but we sort of bootstrapped it, and we thought that if we could at least scan these VCs, some of them would really, resonate with what we were trying to achieve here and the wider vision of really transforming healthcare. And we ended up getting some great investors behind the company, and we've been able to grow it since.
I think it's unique that you probably brought some of these investors into the clinic and said, let me actually do a scan on you. Let me show you the results of that. Now you can come invest into our company. Smart way of using an MVP and a product use case to that to go raise money.
Well, it works both ways, and then when a VC turns you down, they're like, I'm not going to invest in you, but I'm going to use you every year for the rest of my life. I'm like, you sort of want to bang your head against the wall, because that doesn't really make much sense. But yeah, it's always been it reflects the philosophy of the company in general. We have never been quote unquote like marketing forward. We've always been a medical service. We've always wanted to provide a really great experience and clinically accurate exam for our customers. And if we do that, good things will happen. And, in investment, that means we've brought in great investors. We've had a lot of celebrities and high impact voices talk about us publicly, which has raised a lot of awareness. And, it just comes down to we want to be good people, a mission driven company that's, helping save lives.
Andrew, I want to talk about how the operation of building a company like this, when you go and put a lot of your own capital, there's a lot of different ways you can go deploy your own money into actually the early stage of this business. There, you can go put it in human capital, you can put it in technology, you can put it in software. There's so many different ways, and knowing where the capital goes is very difficult as an early stage founder. You're a third-time founder in doing this. Tell us a little bit about where you initially put your funds to go build out that team, whether that was initially where the capital went, or was it to the software? How do you know where to go?
Well, we sort of had a good problem, because what I had witnessed when I sat there and saw 150 people do the scan was that we had product market fit. The core service was something that people wanted. So our challenge was really, our business is not fully online or very online at all. I mean, I need to have a location somewhere so that I can screen you with one of our advanced MRI machines. So I put the money where the only place it really could go, which was in building our location in Silicon Valley. And the rest we sort of like lagged behind. We didn't have the best software product. We didn't have the best mobile apps. We didn't have the best technology stack. We've sort of built that up subsequently. But for us, it was all about, we got to build a clinic where the investors are.
And you're building clinics. There's a lot of CapEx that goes into that. You have to go find locations. You've done it 22 times now. What's the hardest part about this?
I mean, I'd never even renovated a bathroom before I like built this clinic in the Silicon Valley. So I was like, talk about stress. And then in the middle of COVID, it was, it was crazy.
Contractors in place, you're organizing different renovations. That's not easy. And
talk to the city about keeping lights on, on your construction, and everyone following like COVID protocols. And it was, and then when it opened, we didn't know whether anyone would come in. But we're lucky. I mean, to be honest, like one of the saving graces, and this is kind of a funny story, is I was one of the first people in Silicon Valley to get COVID. So I was like the first person at my doctor's office to do a COVID test. And my antibodies were so interesting to people in the Silicon Valley that were building tests that I was like, I just drove up and down the Bay Area giving people blood. And so I would drive up in some back alley of some biotech company. I'd sort of roll down my window. They'd come out in like a full hazmat suit. I sort of like hang my arm sort of backwards out of the window of the car while they sort of like stuck a needle in me and took some blood so they can go build like a COVID test. And what I got in exchange for that was masks. And why do I need masks? Because I had to keep my clinics open. I had two at that point, one in Canada and one in the US. And so we needed those masks. So I was sort of I literally gave blood to the company in order to keep it open during COVID. And it was the only place for a period of time in both those markets where you could get any preventative imaging. You couldn't get a mammogram. You couldn't get a colonoscopy at Stanford or UC System or whatever. The only way you could get any sort of screening was with us. So that was a fun, moment, but that's what you do as an entrepreneur. You do whatever you can to keep things moving forward.
While building this, obviously building a company during COVID is no easy task. You go through so many different challenges, especially doing construction during COVID and launching, your opening day during COVID. Who was probably the most impactful for you throughout this entire journey of building Prenuvo? Did you build a board of advisors? Did you hire anyone from your previous companies throughout this journey?
And we never really did, to be honest. And I don't think that this is best practice. I mean, we probably should have invested more in building a board of advisors. I've had great advisors and I've had real dud advisors. So I think you can never really tell. And there's a lot of companies out there that just say, hey, I want to get like a bunch of, advisors that are, in name only. I just never really understood that strategy. So I would say I got a lot of advice from customers. I would go and hang out in the clinic and I would ask people why they're there, how we can improve the service. I would reach out after people got their results, ask them for feedback. So I would say we built more of a culture of, oriented around feedback. And a lot of the people that were coming in were well-known, CEOs of like quite successful companies. So there's like an opportunity to get feedback from people that I ordinarily wouldn't be able to speak to.
And there's a terminology called founder mode. It seems like you dive deep into it. I'm sure you know what founder mode is, really being in the trenches of your own company, right? And I think sometimes when people are first starting out a venture, they don't know what the next step is sometimes. And you're finding this 800-pound gorilla and you're just contemplating, am I supposed to raise more money? Am I supposed to hire this person? And you just don't have the right directional advice. How do you know what next step to go take when building a company of this nature?
I guess my answer is maybe different to most people. I was someone that became a founder in my 30s. Every so often I think, wow, wouldn't it be, how much further along would I have been if I was a founder, when I was 18 or 19? But the reality is, I spent 10 years gathering a tremendous amount of experience. And most importantly, like problem solving experience in different contexts. And I think, so as a founder later in your career, what you can bring is like experience. Earlier in your career, you don't have the experience, so you're sort of like more heavily dependent on luck, I would say, to like be successful. The challenge with becoming a founder later in life is a lot of people often are not risk taking anymore. So, I was always like, I guess like restless. I always wanted to do something, and those like first 10 years were really formative in giving me this like tremendous problem solving experience from the law, from like advising other companies. And that just made it, I would say, like a lot easier. I would say my superpower is problem solving. So it doesn't really matter what function it is. I can like sit down with a team and ask questions, form hypotheses, and, hopefully move the ball further down the field. And that's, so maybe my advice is more, or sort of like my story is more relatable to people that maybe become founders later in life. When you're early, I think I could see the role of advisors being really, I mean, those are, you're borrowing the experience of others in order to, not make this, avoid as many mistakes as possible.
It's very contrarian if you think about it, right? Because I think a lot of the media, when the stuff you see on Twitter is like, leave the corporate gig, go start the business today. You're in your early 20s. You have nothing to lose at this point. But you look at it from a very different lens. And it's actually a very novel perspective, but I think a lot of people should actually listen to, because you are borrowing experience on other people's dime and then being able to finally step into the shoes of a CEO of your own business, and then cultivate all the learning you've done from education, law, Kinsey, being the CEO of other companies that you didn't put all your money into. And now finally you step up to the plate and now you're ready to go and you have a full swing at bat from all the resources you've done. I think a lot of people today want to go prove themselves at an early age because maybe ego gets in the way. As you hire individuals at your company, the hardest thing to understand is, who will be the proper culture fit, and then how do you also identify talent at the same time too? You seem like you have a very novel EQ, IQ sense to you.
I would say like the two dimensions there are actually, you have sort of experience that grows as you become more, you become older, and then you have sort of risk-taking appetite, which generally goes down. So the equalizer is sort of, on the one hand, it's really hard to build a career that's based on luck, which is sort of in some ways what you are doing if you're sort of an 18-year-old founder, I think. Obviously, there are people that are smarter than others, but fundamentally, you need some luck. It's much easier to organize your life in a way where you can continue to take risks, into your mid-career. So like, don't get into debt, save money along the way. Ideally, if you arrive at your mid-30s and you can like survive, you have enough money set aside to survive for a couple of years, and you want to do it, like there's nothing that really is going to hold you back. But when I hire people, I'm often looking for people that have that sort of energy. They want to come in and learn as much as possible and, want to become entrepreneurs at some point later in their careers too. So I guess I kind of look for like mini me's in some way. And I often will have an explicit conversation. I'm like, hey, your commitment if you join me is you're here for like 2-3 years. If you leave in less than 2 years, I'm going to be annoyed. I'll be pissed at you. If you leave it 2 years to go found some company, I'll invest in it, and hopefully you stick around for like 10 years. But that's sort of the commitment I make, I try and get out of people when I hire them in.
That's a really novel approach. I think a lot of people don't go into that knowing they want to hire people with the intent to say, one day, go start your company, use this as your trade school, and then go build a company and I'll invest it. And I think that's a great way to go attract, talent employees. I'm sure you have a massive talent pool being in Silicon Valley today. Who are some of the most impactful people you've hired from whether this company or the last few companies you brought on that's drastically changed your viewpoint of how to run a business?
Well, I mean, I've hired some, I had one of the first engineers from, I'm blanking on the name of the company, the ones that used to swipe your credit card on the iPhone, Square.
Square.
I hired an engineer that ended up being the sort of founding engineer at Square. I hired a chief of staff that ended up building a mobile analytics company called Chartboost that sold for like $200 million. I brought on a chief business officer who ended up running business for Scopely that sold for like $3 or $4 billion. So I don't know, I've had a lot of folks that have just obviously probably been more successful than I have for sure. And it's super fun. It's great to see people really hopefully learn something and then go and apply it and just be individually successful. I don't know. I think sort of entrepreneurship and life is sort of a repeat sort of interaction game. And so, I think it's amazing some of those people then come reach out and I'm doing business with them again in a different context. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs can maybe take a short-term view to some of the relationships that they build. And I think it's important to be more long-term.
Yeah, I think there's a quote that Scott Galloway once said. He said, I'm going to hire people that I know that can go become best friends at my company, because that will intangibly have a lot more value than hiring someone who's just a salary chaser, right? And he has this law that if 4 people go out to lunch, they can go buy anything they want from lunch. They can go travel together on his dime. And the matter of fact of that is that he's building a culture, and management is turning into culture from him doing so.
I would say like the challenge though is there's definitely a generational. So this sort of pitch that I just gave you worked a lot better like 10 years ago. I think there's sort of a generational change where there's a lot of young people in their 20s. I mean, we hire them where they're looking for a lifestyle, like a more balanced job from the get-go. And I think
exist.
Well, the approach that I've always taken is, in between my companies, I usually take a year or two off. So, I feel like I have balance over a longer period of time. But in any given week, I could be manic, or in any given quarter, or even, during the time of a startup, it can be very busy. But I like that's an investment that I'm willing to make because I'm still learning as an individual. I'm still, hopefully going to achieve a good outcome here, and I can like recharge my batteries like later. And I think the time to make those investments of your time is when you're young, because the further you can get ahead, the more you can learn, the more you apply yourself, the more you sort of like reap the compound returns of that through the rest of your career. And so I give this speech. I used to actually I had a presentation. I give it to like my employees. I don't do it anymore because I used to go, now I start to get, more mixed feedback, I guess. A lot of those, I guess that opinion is being viewed more skeptically by younger generations. It's sort of just code for working harder. And I guess it kind of is, but it's a win-win in the context of a high growth startup. I mean, you can't advance your career better than you can in like a startup that's growing really fast. But to do that, you have to like keep up with your personal development as to keep up with the growth of the company. Otherwise you'll be layered.
Andrew, I'm sure you've faced burnout. You've been in Silicon Valley for a long time. There's just burnout tied to the word Silicon Valley. And after building multiple companies, now you've created a health and wellness company that's changing lives today. During your time that you were burnt out, maybe you took some time off. How do you recover yourself to want to go take on a venture like this again?
Why? Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is just taking time off when you have the moment to do it. Every year I work out of Europe for a month. So that gives me a chance to sort of work, I would say like much more lightly, sort of half time and recharge batteries there. In between ventures, I take time off. And then I guess when you're on your third or fourth company, you also have a bit of emotional resilience. If you have a really bad day or a bad week, you've been through that story before, and the next week can be great. And the inverse is also true. You never quite celebrate as hard like the wins because the following week something bad could happen. But that's sort of like emotion. A lot of the burnout I think comes from like not being able to like regulate the sort of highs and lows, particularly the lows of building companies.
Do you feel like the biggest misconception of building, a very big company is that people don't understand the level of tenacity it takes to go build something at massive scale?
100%. I think, it would be a super boring sort of like movie to see the way that Facebook or Uber or any of these companies were actually built. Because, the made for Hollywood version sort of doesn't do justice for just how many times you just have to dust yourself off and like keep moving stuff forward. 100%. Yeah. And that's a problem. People say, hey, I'm just going to drop out of Harvard or whatever it is, and I'm going to build $1 billion company in the next 6 months because it won't take longer than that, because that movie only took 90 minutes.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Andrew, tell us where you envision Prenuvo. You've started this several years ago now, and you started out of Silicon Valley. And where do you want to take this company?
Well, the big reason why I did it, if I'm being honest, is I wanted to have a KPI that was like meaningful. Tapulous, that first company, I mean, our KPI was billions of hours spent in our apps. Every single way that we are now sucking attention, out of our eyeballs into our phones, we piloted that at Tapulous. So we built a great company, but we didn't really make the world, I think, necessarily a better place. So that was going to be my KPI. And so we track now every life-saving diagnosis that we make. And we probably we made thousands of these now. And, we share them with the entire team whenever we hear about them. And the goal really is just to connect everyone with that mission. And that mission doesn't stop until we have a healthcare system that is focused around proactive and preventive health rather than this sick care system that we have today.
How do you feel you're going to merge Prenuvo with how healthcare is built today? I'm sure you guys mean more of a cash basis, I assume. rather than using any sort of insurance?
Well, we're cash now, but I think my belief is that if we did much more comprehensive preventive tests using imaging and blood, which is what we do at Prenuvo, we could probably have a healthcare system that was half the size it is today and have much better outcomes for individuals. So that's our belief. And, so our job is to collect the evidence base so that we can then go present that to health insurers and employers and health systems. And I don't think it'll be in the next year or two that there's going to be change, but I do think in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we will see people starting to fund these things, for populations. And we're going to look back in 20 or 30 years and just shake our heads at the way that we diagnose disease today.
Andrew, you've been a wealth of knowledge on this pod. As I, always like to wrap things up, I want to go with a series of rapid fire questions that, hopefully makes you think a little bit. More talks about the conceptual of rationale of why you build big companies today, more about the matter of fact of, life is such a short period of time. You're building something that's creating massive impact here. And sometimes founders who come on this pod and listeners who listen to this are just chasing money. But then in reality, you're building something today that's preventing, diseases, mal illnesses. And this is where, people could really start understanding what a founder really looks like. And I think the first question I want to ask you is, what's the trade-off that high performers don't talk about enough? I think a lot of people, go into a venture unwary and, not very present in the time being of why they're going down their pursuit. And if you were to go point at one thing, what would that be?
Well, I think we sort of mentioned it's just that this is very hard. I mean, you got to this is a marathon, not a sprint, is sort of the thing people say. And I think that, I see two errors being made. The first error is people jumping in without really realizing just how all-consuming this is. And, so that you need to have your affairs in order, what I mean by that is, make sure that you have a way to live without as much capital, have a way, have relationships that are in good place. We have a lot of credits built up. And I see the other error people make is I see tremendously talented people that really would, I think, make great entrepreneurs, but they haven't built the courage to make that leap. And the challenge is, I think starting a company is like having a child. When you think about having a child, you think about all the ways it can negatively affect your life. You lose control over your time. You're going to, you can imagine, but you have no way of quantifying the love that you feel for the child. And I think being an entrepreneur is the same thing. How do you quantify really being in control of your destiny and doing something cool that no one's done before and bringing joy to people or having this, having a great positive impact on people's lives? How do you value that? And I think a lot of people don't take the leap because they try to rationalize becoming an entrepreneur. You can't rationalize it.
That was very well said. What question do you wish people ask you more often, Andrew?
What's it like on the inside? I think a lot of people say, hey, you're running a great company and everything's cool and it must be incredible. And, you always look outside from the inside out and everyone looks from the outside in. So I think, I've taught myself whenever I see another company, it seems to be going great. I remind myself probably on the inside, they share a lot of the issues that we have. So I think we don't talk about that enough,
Yeah. What are you afraid of you'll regret when you get older?
The main challenge I'm trying to solve for with Prenuvo, which is, what am I going to do with this one wild and beautiful life? Am I working on a KPI here that I can look back on, in my old age and just say that was worth it?
Do you feel today that you're on the right trajectory?
Definitely more. I mean, I feel like I got some credit now. I'm not out there trying to do bad things, but I feel like I have credit in my bank account right now.
If I were to give you a trophy today about everything you built thus far at Prenuvo, what would that trophy be for?
The trophy I would like to have is for proving everyone wrong. I think at the core of it, and for sure, it's probably ego. When every time I read an article where people are questioning whether we should even be doing what we're doing, it makes me smile on the inside.
And lastly, where's Prenuvo going over the next 5 to 10 years?
We're going international. We are opening in Australia, where I'm from. We're opening in Europe. We're introducing more modalities. We want to be the physical that you do every year to stay on top of your health. And that could be because you're sort of a longevity junkie, or it might be just because you have a busy, stressful life and you want some insurance to know that everything under the skin is fine.
Andrew, I think I'm heading to a clinic at Prenuvo here soon, so you got me excited.
Awesome. I think
Where
you're
can we
going
find more?
insurance camp,
Yeah,
so you can keep working your butt off.
there you go. Where can people find out more about you, Andrew, and Prenuvo?
Well, Prenuvo is, people can visit our website, prenuvo.com. There's a page there on locations where you can see where we're at and where we're coming. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions. No hard sell. We want people to understand whether this is helpful for them. And I guess they can follow me on Twitter. Andrew Lacy is my handle. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments on the episode.
Andrew, that's a bod. Appreciate it, brother.
Thanks.